The alpine wind screamed across the Bernese Oberland at 11,000 feet, but Heinrich Steiner barely felt it anymore. He stood on a narrow ledge carved into the Aletsch Glacier, his leather gloves gripping a long-handled ice axe, his breath forming clouds in the -18-degree air. Behind him, cut 35 feet deep into the ancient blue ice, lay the shelter that everyone said was impossible. It was March 1941, and the young glaciologist had spent the last 4 months proving that a man could survive inside a glacier, not despite the ice, but because of it. The valley town of Grindelwald, far below, had called him mad. The Swiss army officers who had rejected his proposal had laughed at his drawings. Even his own father, a respected engineer in Bern, had written letters begging him to abandon this foolishness. But Heinrich had spent 3 years studying glacier formations in Greenland and Norway before the war, and he understood what others refused to believe, that properly excavated glacier ice, dense as granite and stable for millennia, could provide shelter superior to any wooden cabin or stone hut ever built in these mountains. 7 months earlier, in August 1940, Heinrich had presented his idea to the Grindelwald Mountain Rescue Service during their monthly meeting at the Hotel Eiger. The room had been packed with experienced guides, men who'd spent their entire lives in these mountains. Captain Ernst Weber, the rescue service commander and a third-generation alpine guide, had listened to Heinrich's proposal with increasing disbelief. "You want to live inside the Aletsch Glacier," Weber had said slowly, as if speaking to a child. "Not build a shelter near it, not use ice blocks for construction. Actually excavate a living space into the glacier itself." Heinrich had unrolled his technical drawings on the scarred wooden table. The glacier ice at depth is compressed over thousands of years. At 35 feet into the formation, the density reaches 900 kilograms per cubic meter. It's essentially crystalline rock. With proper excavation techniques and minimal structural support, it can provide stable shelter with natural insulation properties that would cost thousands of francs to replicate in a conventional structure. The room had erupted in laughter. Dr. Klaus Hoffmann, the town's physician and an amateur mountaineer, had wiped tears from his eyes. "Heinrich," he'd said, his voice mixing amusement with genuine concern, "ice melts. It shifts and flows like a river. You'd wake up crushed or drowned in meltwater. This isn't science. It's suicide." "The glacier flows at the surface," Heinrich had countered calmly. "But at depth, below the plastic zone, the movement is less than 5 centimeters per year. Indigenous Arctic peoples have used ice structures for shelter for thousands of years. I'm simply applying those principles with modern glaciological understanding." Friedrich Gruber, who ran the climbing equipment shop and considered himself an expert on mountain survival, had shaken his head. "The Inuit build temporary snow houses for short-term shelter. You're talking about permanent habitation in a glacier at 11,000 feet. There's a reason no one has ever done this, Heinrich. Because it's impossible." "Not impossible," Heinrich had replied. "Simply unconventional." The vote had been unanimous. Proposal denied. Too dangerous, too experimental, too likely to result in a rescue operation when the inevitable collapse occurred. But Heinrich had not given up. He'd spent the next month writing a detailed technical proposal, including thermal calculations, structural analyses of glacier ice at various depths, and citations from Arctic exploration journals. He'd submitted it directly to the Swiss Alpine Club's scientific committee in Zurich. Dr. Werner Amann, a glaciologist who'd read Heinrich's earlier papers on ice formation, had been intrigued enough to visit Grindelwald in person. The two men had climbed to the Aletsch together, and Heinrich had shown him the exact location he'd selected. A south-facing section of the glacier at 11,200 feet, accessible via a steep but manageable route from the Concordia hut. The ice face here was nearly vertical for 25 feet before the glacier's mass angled back into the mountain, providing natural protection from avalanches and allowing for deep excavation without compromising the glacier's structural integrity. Ammon had examined Heinrich's calculations and run his own tests on the ice density. A week later, he'd sent a letter with surprising news. The Alpine Club would provide 8,000 Swiss francs for a 3-month experimental project. If Heinrich could successfully excavate and inhabit a glacial shelter through one winter season, it would be documented as a significant contribution to alpine survival research. The mockery in Grindelwald had intensified immediately. At the general store, the clerk had asked loudly whether Heinrich needed any coffin dimensions for when they recovered his frozen body. At the post office, people made jokes about sending mail to his ice tomb. The local newspaper ran a piece titled, "Scientist Plans to Become Permanent Glacier Resident," with the clear implication that he'd be dead within weeks. Maria Steiner, Heinrich's younger sister who worked as a teacher in the village, had faced the worst of it. Her students' parents questioned whether someone from a family with such poor judgment should be teaching their children. One mother had withdrawn her daughter from Maria's class entirely, stating that she wouldn't have her child influenced by a family that endorsed suicide. Maria had visited Heinrich the night before he departed for the glacier. She'd stood in the doorway of his small rented room, watching him pack equipment. "You don't have to prove anything to these people," she'd said quietly. "Let them think what they want. Come back down." "This isn't about them," Heinrich had replied, carefully coiling climbing rope. "It's about understanding what's possible. The mountains have always killed people who didn't respect them, but they also shelter those who understand them. I've studied glacier mechanics for years. I know this will work. And if you're wrong, then I'll be wrong," he'd said simply. "But I'm not." He'd begun work on September 2nd, 1940, climbing from the Concordia hut with 60 kilograms of equipment strapped to a wooden frame on his back. The site he'd chosen required a brutal 5-hour approach, but it was perfect. The glacier face angled at 70 degrees, with natural ice formations providing handholds for the climb. The blue ice here glowed with an ethereal light, compressed over 12,000 years into dense, crystalline layers. The first week was devoted to establishing safe access. Using techniques he'd learned from Inuit hunters in Greenland, Heinrich carved a zigzag pathway into the ice face. Each step was cut 16 inches deep with an ice axe, angled slightly inward for safety. Every fourth step received a wooden stake, frozen into place with water that solidified overnight in the sub-zero temperatures. The work was exhausting. Heinrich started each day at 3 a.m., working in the coldest hours when the ice was most stable. By noon, when temperatures rose to just below freezing, he'd retreat to his tent, pitched on a narrow ledge 200 feet below the worksite. Each afternoon was spent maintaining equipment, melting snow for water, and eating the high-calorie rations he'd hauled up the mountain. Cheese, dried meat, chocolate, butter. He consumed 4,500 calories per day to fuel his body against the cold and the brutal physical labor. By September 20th, the access path was complete, and Heinrich could safely reach his chosen excavation site. Now came the real work. The excavation began with careful planning. Heinrich had designed the shelter as a single elongated chamber, 18 feet wide at the entrance, tapering to 12 feet at the rear, and extending 35 feet into the glacier. The ceiling would follow the natural curve of the ice formation, creating a space approximately 7 feet high at the center. This wasn't arbitrary. These dimensions would provide adequate living space for one person while minimizing the amount of ice that needed to be removed, roughly 320 cubic meters of glacier ice, each cubic meter weighing nearly 900 kilograms. The cutting technique required precision and patience. Heinrich used a combination of hand tools and a specialized heated blade he'd designed, a 3-foot steel plate maintained at 75 degrees Celsius using a small kerosene burner. The heated blade could cut through glacier ice efficiently, creating smooth walls less likely to fracture. But the heat had to be carefully controlled. Too much would weaken the surrounding ice structure. Too little made progress impossibly slow. Each day, Heinrich cut approximately 2.5 cubic meters of ice. He'd mark cutting lines with charcoal, then use the heated blade to create initial grooves. Ice axes and chisels completed the work, breaking out blocks that he'd haul to the entrance on a wooden sled and push over the cliff face. The ice blocks would tumble 300 feet down the glacier, shattering into thousands of fragments that glittered in the sunlight. The physical toll was severe. Heinrich's hands, despite heavy gloves, developed deep cracks from the constant contact with ice tools. His shoulders burned from the repetitive motions of swinging the axe. Twice he developed mild frostbite on his fingertips when he'd worked too long without warming breaks. But he'd planned for this. Every 45 minutes, he'd stop work and retreat to a small warming tent he'd erected at the excavation entrance, where a kerosene heater brought the temperature to just above freezing. 10 minutes of warming, then back to work. The rhythm became meditative. Cut, chip, haul, warm. Cut, chip, haul, warm. Days blurred into weeks. By late October, the main chamber was excavated. Heinrich stood at the entrance, looking into the space he'd carved from ancient ice. The walls glowed with that distinctive blue light, sunlight filtered through compressed glacial layers. The temperature inside held steady at -3 degrees Celsius, exactly as his calculations had predicted. But a carved hole in ice wasn't yet a shelter. Now came the technical work that would determine whether this experiment succeeded or became the disaster everyone predicted. The insulation system was critical. Heinrich had studied traditional Inuit construction methods and adapted them for his purposes. He built interior walls using 3-inch thick wooden planks, creating an air gap of 6 inches between the wood and the ice. This dead airspace would trap heat while preventing warm interior air from reaching the ice walls and causing destructive melting. The wood came from dismantled shipping crates he'd hauled up the mountain piece by piece over 3 weeks, each trip carrying 15 kilograms of lumber strapped to his back. He'd calculated he needed exactly 85 square meters of planking. He cut and fitted each piece with a carpenter's precision, using a level constantly to ensure proper installation. The floor received special attention. Cold air sinks, making the floor the coldest area of any shelter. Heinrich laid wooden pallets as a base, then 4 inches of compressed hay for insulation, then a final layer of wooden boards. The result was a floor that felt almost warm compared to the surrounding ice. The heating and ventilation system combines simplicity with innovation. Heinrich carved a ventilation shaft at a 45-degree angle through 40 feet of glacier ice to the surface. This shaft, 8 inches in diameter, served dual purposes, drawing in fresh air while allowing smoke to escape. The angle prevented snow from accumulating and blocking it. The heater itself was a modified Swedish Primus stove, designed for continuous operation. It burned approximately 1.5 liters of kerosene per day, generating enough heat to maintain an interior temperature of 6 to 8 degrees Celsius, even when outside temperatures dropped below -30. But the most technically challenging element was ensuring the structure's long-term stability. Glacier ice, despite its density, is not static. It shifts microscopically, responding to temperature changes and the massive weight of the ice above it. Heinrich's solution was flexibility. Rather than rigidly anchoring the wooden walls to the ice, he used a sliding bracket system that allowed 2 centimeters of movement in any direction. The walls could shift with the ice's natural micro-movements without cracking or collapsing. Installing this system required drilling 40 holes through the ice to depths of 8 to 12 feet, each hole receiving a flexible anchor bolt. The drilling was done with a hand-cranked auger, exhausting work that took 3 full weeks. Heinrich's arms would shake with fatigue by the end of each day, but he never rushed. Precision mattered more than speed. One improperly installed anchor could compromise the entire structure. By mid-November, the shelter was complete. Heinrich had excavated 320 cubic meters of ice, installed 85 square meters of insulation, and created what was effectively an underground room, invisible from the air and accessible only to someone who knew exactly where to look. The entrance was camouflaged, a wooden door painted to match the blue-white ice and positioned to blend with natural ice formations. From 50 feet away, it was nearly impossible to spot. The interior was Spartan but functional. A wooden bunk built against one wall, with wool blankets and a down sleeping bag. A small work table with a kerosene lamp for light. Wooden crates stacked along another wall holding 3 months of food supplies, dried goods, canned meat, chocolate, coffee. A shelf with books, because Heinrich knew that isolation and boredom could be as dangerous as the cold. The heating stove in the corner, its pipe running up through the ventilation shaft, and everywhere, the blue glow of glacier ice filtering through gaps in the wooden walls, a constant reminder that he was living inside a frozen river that had been flowing for millennia. The official test began on November 20th, 1940. Dr. Ammon from the Alpine Club made the climb with 3 other observers, scientists and mountaineers, who'd come to document what they expected to be an interesting failure. They toured the shelter in silence, testing the temperature with thermometers, examining the insulation, checking the ventilation. Outside temperature was minus 22 degrees Celsius. Inside, it was 7 degrees. Dr. Ammon spent 15 minutes examining the flexible anchor system, testing each bolt, studying the bracket design. Finally, he spoke. "The engineering is sound," he admitted. "But Heinrich, winter hasn't truly arrived yet. When temperatures drop to minus 40, when storms last for days, when the glacier experiences its seasonal stress changes, we'll see if this holds. If you survive until March, you'll have proven something remarkable. If not," he paused, "we'll document what went wrong so others don't repeat the attempt." The observers descended the mountain, and Heinrich settled into his routine. He maintained a strict schedule, understanding that discipline was essential for psychological survival in isolation. Wake at 6 a.m., check the heater, ensure the ventilation shaft was clear. Breakfast, usually oatmeal cooked on the stove with dried fruit and butter. Morning work period, during which he'd maintain the shelter, check all systems, make repairs. Lunch. Afternoon reading or writing in his journal. Evening meal. An hour of reading before sleep. Once per week, weather permitting, he'd descend to Concordia Hut to resupply and send reports to Dr. Ammon. The winter of 1940 to 1941 tested everything. Temperatures at 11,200 feet regularly dropped below minus 35 degrees Celsius. Wind speeds exceeded 120 kilometers per hour. Snow accumulation around the shelter entrance reached 8 feet, requiring Heinrich to dig out the door every 3 days. But inside the glacier, Heinrich lived in relative comfort. The interior temperature never dropped below 5 degrees Celsius. The kerosene heater ran efficiently, its fuel consumption exactly matching Heinrich's calculations. The insulation performed perfectly, and the flexible anchor system allowed the shelter to adapt to the ice's minute movements without any structural stress. On January 12, 1941, the worst storm of the winter arrived. For 4 days, the wind howled at speeds that made standing outside impossible. The temperature plunged to -42 degrees Celsius. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. Heinrich remained inside, monitoring his systems, reading, maintaining his routine. On the second day of the storm, he heard a deep, groaning sound, the glacier itself shifting under the thermal stress. The wooden walls creaked. One of the anchor bolts moved 1.5 centimeters, visible because Heinrich had marked each one with a reference line. But the flexible system absorbed the movement. Nothing cracked, nothing collapsed. By the 4th day, when the storm finally broke, Heinrich emerged to find the world transformed. Snow had drifted 12 feet high in some places. The entrance to his shelter was buried under 9 feet of compacted snow. It took him 6 hours to dig out, but the shelter itself was undamaged. Meanwhile, in Grindelwald, far below, the storm had been catastrophic. 3 climbers attempting to descend from the Eiger had died of exposure. A mountain hut at 8,000 feet had lost its roof to the wind, and the 6 people inside had barely survived by huddling in the ruins until rescue arrived. Traditional stone shelters throughout the region reported frozen water supplies, heating failures, and in 2 cases, partial structural collapse from snow load. But the man living inside a glacier at 11,200 feet had weathered the storm in warmth and safety, his shelter performing exactly as designed. Word of Heinrich's survival began to spread. Climbers and guides who'd mocked his project now asked questions. How had he stayed warm? What had he eaten? How had he managed ventilation? The skepticism slowly shifted to curious respect. On February 18th, Captain Weber from the Mountain Rescue Service made the climb to the glacier. He arrived exhausted, having underestimated the difficulty of the approach. Heinrich offered him tea, brewed on the shelter's stove, and gave him a tour of the facility. Weber examined everything in silence. Finally, he spoke. "I told you this was impossible," he said heavily. "I told the entire town you were committing suicide. I was wrong. Dead wrong." Heinrich nodded quietly. "You weren't wrong to be skeptical, Captain. This approach contradicts conventional mountain shelter design, but conventional wisdom isn't always complete. The Inuit have known for generations that ice can shelter. I simply applied that knowledge in a new context." "What would it take to build more of these?" Weber asked. Another question. If war comes to these mountains, if we need defensive positions at extreme altitude, could this method be used? Heinrich had already considered this. The Aletsch is unique in some ways, but there are at least 8 other glaciers in the Swiss Alps with similar characteristics. With a trained team and proper equipment, you could excavate a shelter like this in 6 to 8 weeks. It would be expensive in time and labor, but the result would be a position that's invisible from the air, naturally camouflaged, and sustainable with minimal resupply. Conventional high-altitude positions require constant fuel deliveries for heating. This method reduces that need by 80%. The war context became urgent in March 1941. German forces swept through the Balkans, and Switzerland mobilized its defenses. The Swiss army suddenly became very interested in Heinrich's glacier shelter. On March 15th, a military delegation climbed to the site. Colonel Hans Müller, commander of Alpine troops, inspected the shelter with a team of military engineers. They tested everything: the heating efficiency, the structural stability, the defensive potential of a position carved into solid ice. One engineer, a captain named Thomas Becker, spent an hour examining the flexible anchor system. "This is brilliant," he said finally. "We've been building concrete bunkers that crack from thermal stress and ice formation. You've built something that moves with the ice, that uses the glacier's own properties for insulation and protection. Could you train others in these techniques?" Heinrich agreed. Over the next 2 months, he worked with military engineers, teaching them glaciological principles, excavation methods, and the critical details of building inside ice. 3 experimental military positions were started at other glaciers, incorporating Heinrich's designs. By June 1941, the Swiss Army had officially adopted glacier shelter construction as a viable method for high-altitude defensive positions. Heinrich Steiner, the scientist who'd been called suicidal and mad, was commissioned as a technical advisor with the rank of captain. His shelter in the Aletsch became a training site where Alpine troops learned the techniques that might one day save their lives. The original shelter remained in use until 1952, serving as a high-altitude weather station and rescue cache. It required minimal maintenance over those 11 years. The wooden insulation needed replacing only once. The heater was upgraded in 1947, but the excavated ice chamber itself remained stable and unchanged, a testament to Heinrich's understanding of glacier mechanics. In 1953, the shelter was finally abandoned when a military road was built, providing easier access to high-altitude positions. But the structure itself was left intact, sealed, and marked on maps as a historic site. Modern glaciologists studying the Aletsch have located it several times. As recently as 2019, researchers examining glacier ice cores found the chamber still preserved, the wooden walls intact after 78 years, the flexible anchors still in place. The glacier's slow flow had moved the entire structure approximately 15 meters from its original position, but the structural integrity remained perfect. Heinrich Steiner became a professor of glaciology at the University of Zurich after the war, teaching for 35 years before retiring in 1976. He published extensively on ice mechanics and cold weather survival, always emphasizing the same principle that had guided his original experiment. Nature, properly understood and respected, provides solutions that human engineering often struggles to replicate. The lesson isn't to reject modern methods, but to combine them with traditional knowledge and natural principles. His students remember him as a man who never spoke about his glacier shelter unless asked directly. When pressed, he would say simply that he'd wanted to test a hypothesis about ice stability and thermal properties. The fact that it contradicted conventional wisdom had been incidental. Science wasn't about following convention. It was about testing ideas rigorously and accepting results honestly. He passed away in 1989 at age 73, having lived long enough to see his glacier shelter techniques adopted by mountaineers, researchers, and military organizations in 7 countries. Arctic research stations in Greenland and Antarctica used modified versions of his insulation methods. The Swiss Army maintained glacier positions based on his designs until the end of the Cold War. But Heinrich himself always insisted he'd discovered nothing new. Indigenous peoples had been using ice for shelter for thousands of years. He'd simply remembered what modern civilization had forgotten: that sometimes the strongest shelter is the one nature already provided, waiting for someone humble enough to work with it rather than against it. The Aletsch Glacier continues its ancient flow, moving at its patient pace of meters per year. Somewhere deep within its blue ice, the chamber Heinrich Steiner carved in 1940 still exists, preserved perfectly in the frozen darkness. A monument not to human dominance over nature, but to human wisdom in cooperating with it. And in Grindelwald, where once they'd mocked the mad scientist who wanted to live in ice, there's now a small museum display. It shows photographs of Heinrich at work, his technical drawings, and a simple plaque. When others called it impossible, one man called it science. When the winter came, the ice proved him right. The lesson remains, carved not in stone, but in glacier ice that will endure for millennia.